And very pleasant good morning, everybody. Welcome to Bury Your Bookie. I'm Jeff DeForrest. Happy to have you guys with us along for the ride. And we start right out, not with basketball, Jones, but with our good friend Mike Jones, who joins us here. And I don't know what kind of bracket bloodbath your weekend was like. It didn't seem like there was an overwhelming number of upsets taking place in the tournament. We did see two 12 versus 5 victors. Colorado State, who, as you had pointed out during the early portion of the week, when you were on with us, oddly was favored as a 12 seed in their opening game, and then went right down to the wire in what was probably the most exciting finish, very indicative of the championship game in Houston many years ago between North Carolina and Villanova, where Diakonu took the ball down the court there, and they got a jumper from the top of the key after North Carolina had hit a three to take the lead late in the game, a game that they looked like they were going down in. I remember Michael Jordan leaping through the roof of the Energy Stadium there, and everybody's thinking, wow, North Carolina pulled off a miracle, only to be denied in the end. And that's kind of what transpired in that Colorado State Maryland game, which I desperately needed Maryland to hold up my end of the bargain on some brackets. It's getting touched up a little bit in the second round of the tournament in the pool that we're in together.
Yes.
You put me into, which first day or two for the first round didn't seem all that difficult.
No.
Got a little bit more dicey in the ride to the Sweet 16 in the second round of the tournament. But how did you fare? I mean, I have my tournament takes here outlined, Mike Jones. So what did you think, your general impression?
I lost St. John's in the 8. I lost Iowa State as one of my 8s. I think my Final Fours altogether. My champion still sitting there with Florida. Got a big scare yesterday. So, everybody's holding their breath as Florida looks like you guys are work cut out for them to get by Connecticut. And then at one point, they almost look like they're going to cover 10. They're down the whole game. And then at the end, I think they had a chance with the ball up 8. And then, Connecticut had some shot at a 3 at the end to get it down to 2. But, just what a weekend. It's always the best. I thought the chalk, the first 3, I said the first 3 seeds would hold up. There wouldn't be any big upsets. And I'm going to stick to this that going forward that the NIL money is going to change a little bit and revolutionize basketball. The better players will surround themselves with the players, almost like the NBA, where they're organized together to get on certain programs. So hopefully we continue to some of these upsets. I mean, we do have a very intriguing 10 seed still alive. We got a point guard back who was very good. Who took out my St. John's, who I was kind of hoping that, Rick Pitino would make that run. But you saw their flaws. Toward the end of the game, that they just can't make shots. They shot, I think, 20% from 3 or even less, I think, and their field goal percentage was in the 30s. You just, you could do all that great rebounding, defensive, coach-up stuff, but you got to get the ball in the hoop at this time of the year to get far, win titles. So, but it was a great weekend. The hoop was great. Not as much buzzer beaters as you wanted, like the Maryland Colorado State game, but for brackets, there's not a lot of bracket busting. So I think people should be happy going into this week that probably most of their champions are still alive. And probably in my case, I got all of my Final Four because I broke precedents and didn't take any of but 1 seeds, and they're all sitting there.
A couple of teams were threatened. Duke has been dominant. If you are going to be betting, and we'll have a lot of recommendations for you during the course of the week from our handicappers here, including Mike, on the show. BetOnline is your world's most trusted betting platform, your number one source for online betting in 2025. It doesn't matter if you're a seasoned fan or better, like Mike Jones. BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion. You could be a novice beginner, and it's the place to go. With the largest selection of odds on everything from NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC. A lot of boxing coming up as well. BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with the odds, the stats, information, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. All right, I want to get a couple of your observations. Here's one I was looking at. Duke, dominant so far. They're the one team that really had clear sailing. Their margin, their differential so far has been more than 65 points. And the reason I bring this up, they are only the second team to lead in regular season differential and then win their first 2 games in the tournament by a total of 65 or more. It's the first time, this is the first time it's happened since Duke did it in 1999. And it's the 19th time, like I said, that this situation has arisen. That Duke team lost to UConn And so think about it. I mean, if only one team in 19 or two in 19 have achieved that, it's not really a forbear. I mean, that's a 111 batting average. We're talking Bud Harrelson here.
Yeah.
So the team that accomplishes that and seems to be a dominant force doesn't always go on to win the thing. I don't know. From what you've seen so far, you would have to think that Duke is going to be an extremely difficult out. Their next outing is against Arizona, who was down 19-4 to Oregon before they rallied and started
Mm-hmm.
out of the building there. Ended up winning, I think, by 4 points, but they
He did.
took control in a game and
Yeah.
didn't seem to be threatened once they seized the
Mm-hmm.
advantage in that game. Do you see an upset on the horizon there? Because the other teams all faced a challenge, as you mentioned. I had Florida going to the Final Four as a number one seed. Brilliant reach on my part. I also have Houston winning it all, which I'm not so sure about now because they were in a bit of a dogfight till they eventually pulled
Yeah.
it to the end. And the other team that I had in the Final Four was Michigan State, and
Mm-hmm.
they were definitely challenged by Richie Pitino in New Mexico.
Yes. Yeah, one of the things you watch this week in consistency is I think the pressure. I always feel this, and at least since the rise of social media and the outside distraction, is that and the coaches too. There's so much on the line here for the livelihood of the players, coaches, the psyche that you get a lead of 8 or 10 with 4 minutes to go, and you do everything you can to get there. Now all of a sudden, let's hold the ball, take 20 seconds off the clock, let's play less, and that's exactly what Houston did. It's exactly what Arizona did. And you see these teams blow leads. So if you're a gambler, you're stressing out like I got this Houston Gonzaga game in the bag, and now it's a 1 point game with 30 seconds to go because they don't want to move the ball more than 5 feet over midcourt. They want to hold the ball and 5 So I think there becomes a time when the coaching matchups are going to have to take you have to take a look at when you're handicapping that who's going to be the guy that you feel comfortable game managing moving forward that you might add that into your handicapping you'll look as you observe these games. And there's one game in particular that I'm really looking at where I'm going to see something, and I always like to grab hold to the underdog and the lower seeded team. But, I'm looking at the Arkansas Texas Tech game as being one of those games where I'm not so sure that Texas Tech is really as good as people think. And I think Arkansas getting the guard back showed against St. John's that they were never, that game got a little bit away. And I know they played well defensively, but I think when you really look back and dig into that game, maybe that 7.5 line was a little off, obviously, that maybe Arkansas figured out a way to, let St. John's take those, a couple feet behind the arc threes and really condense down on Okafor, and that's what they did, and they got away with the W. So, yeah, so there's some intriguing matchups. Another team that I think we ought to talk about, Jeff, who's very impressive, who I've been down on for recent weeks, who I love their coach, love their talent, but didn't play well throughout the years, Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Ole Miss probably was
People had
impressive.
them going out to either of the lower seeds that they were going to face. North Carolina, of course,
Right.
they stomped on, and most people were predicting they were going to lose to San Diego State if they had prevailed.
Right. And so when you look at Ole Miss, I thought of all the, we have a record 7 teams from the SEC in the Sweet 16. We're pretty much in SEC country if you look at basketball down here. And, it's very impressive. But Ole Miss was a team that probably people had one and done, especially how impressive North Carolina looked. Seeing that team be a favorite in the next round game probably gave a wake-up call to Ole Miss. Padula, the guard, is excellent, handles the ball, doesn't turn it over all that much, and they're getting away with it. But 2 very decisive, impressive wins over North Carolina and Iowa State. So Michigan State's going to have their hands full. You look for dogs. The fun part about this part of the tournament, you look for a dog that can take that run. I see maybe Ole Miss probably by the way they're playing, and definitely look at Arkansas as a team that can win. And so that's the fun part about this when this time when you go. But I think all these matchups are very, very impressive. Even the Alabama BYU game, should that be an exciting game to watch? The up and down. Alabama has to play a little slower than they normally want tempo going up against St. Mary's, but skilled players, better players, athletes prevailed in the end. And then the BYU Wisconsin game looked like that was going to get away from him. And all of a sudden, BYU goes into a shell, does the exact same thing we're talking about. And now they're trying to hold on to get the upset win. And sure enough, Tanjay and Wisconsin, who played an unbelievable second half, come out and make that game a 1-possession game at the end. So, yeah, so there's a lot. These games are fun. They're not exciting, but watching a team change their way of playing up a lead with 5 or 4 minutes to go, and now they're like, oh, we got this. Yeah, maybe you don't. I think that's the fun of this at this time of the year.
BYU, the professor was all over BYU. He loved them because they have a bunch of chuckers, and it was interesting, emblematic of their 3-point range, and the fact that they have a lot of guys that are similar. Was Jimmer Fredette's presence. It was almost
Yes.
like Sister Jean with Loyola of Chicago.
Yeah.
And yet I couldn't take myself and break myself away from every time they showed a shot of Jimmer Fredette, who was an extremely
Oh,
likable
yeah.
story when he was chucking a
Oh.
rock there in the NCAA tournament and knocking down all those threes. Everybody that ever loved an outside shot or
Mhm.
never saw an outside shot that they wouldn't take was a big fan of Jimmer, except how did he bury the U.S. team in that 3-on-3?
Yeah.
Where they put together, you can't tell me they couldn't have assembled better talent than an aging Jimmer Fredette and any Barry son, son of Rick Barry, who you would never heard of before.
Right.
That was disgraceful. We invented the damn game, Mike Jones.
Uh,
How the heck did we throw those guys out there? But BYU was highly touted by the professor. He loved the way that they were playing, and so now they go on and take on Alabama, which you think would have more athleticism and power. But maybe that can be offset by the 3-point shot, which was really the tragic flaw of St. John's. And I know you had some thoughts, or probably do, on the fact that Rick Pitino benched his best player, who was
yeah.
a lousy 3 for 17. Was that just an act of stubbornness there? Because when the rest of your team is doing nothing, and you've already benched this guy, he's having a horrible game. I don't know if he was doing something that so alienated Pitino that he just got frustrated and said, "Hey, that's it. I'm not going to tolerate this crap anymore from you, even though you carried us to this point." I know everybody would be referencing the John Starks game where Pat
Yeah.
Riley let Starks continue to shoot even though he was ice cold in that Knicks playoff game. I'm not sure this was the same circumstance because when the rest of your team can't shoot a lick, would you not have reinserted that guy into the lineup as the game was slipping away in the end? It was still a tightly contested ball game until the last few minutes. Wouldn't you throw that guy back out there and think, okay, he sat his time on the bench here. He's had a chance to compose himself a little bit. Star players will come out and knock down their first couple of shots after that,
Yeah.
regardless of how ice cold they were. What did you make of that whole incident? Was Patino being overly stubborn,
Well,
or perhaps was something else in play there where the player said something to Patino that made him think, hey, I don't care what happens here. You're not getting back in the ballgame.
that would be my guess. I would have to say that something actually happened. Knowing you need offense, you're down. You have to kind of do them. And he's the Big East Player of the Year. You would think something happened. His face on the bench told me that maybe something did happen. That he got out, exchange. He was having a rough day. He's frustrated. He's 3 for 17. And then Patino said, maybe you got to do something different. And the kid might have lipped off to him. And I know that it happens a lot more than it did, years ago. I know we would have known if he was saying that to Bob Knight, we would have known right then and there. But today's a different world. But I just look at it like something did happen there, and I got a call immediately after the game by someone very close to Patino who was extremely frustrated that Luis was on the bench. So I'm sure I'll get a little bit more answers as the week goes on when I talk to her again. But that was the initial reaction to a lot of people was that, what happened. So he'll answer, and probably privately, but the boosters and the people close to him are going to know that I would say you're right. It must have been some kind of exchange that happened there that did that way. And he was going to be stubborn and say, that's it. I mean, guys were fouling out, I think, and he didn't even put him in the game. So it's like,
That was strange.
the old Gene Hackman, let's play with 4.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It became a very visual storyline as
Yeah.
the cameras seized on this, and you saw the frustration of the player. But you're thinking when it got to the point where it was becoming clear that Arkansas was going to win the ball game, or if they didn't find a way to score, I think I'm throwing a guy back out there. And I don't know that I would have stayed with the conviction that if he cursed me out, I wouldn't have thrown him out there. You have a chance to go to the Sweet 16, and that was a real bracket buster for a lot of people that started to believe that St. John's was capable of even making the Final Four. I didn't have them going there, but other people did, and a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon at 25 and 30 to 1 for them to win the whole tournament after the display they had in the Big East regular season, and then subsequently winning the Big East tournament. So that was a bit of a disappointment because Patino was really riding a high. He's on the late night shows, and he's on every podcast, and he is a delightful guy to listen to, and very, very engaging, and a speaker that always draws you into his conversation. And he seemed to be riding a real high. So that was kind of a strange story. He wouldn't address it afterwards. So some great post game quotes by a lot of the coaches. You had to love Calipari after the Pasta Bowl, as a lot of people were labeling it, saying they put us in the coffin, but they forgot to nail it shut.
Right.
That was great. You had the Maryland coach saying that Queen comes into the huddle and he's looking around the huddle and he says, "Okay, who wants the ball?" And Queen says, "Give me the motherfucking ball." And at that point, do you not give him the ball? It was very Keyshawn Johnson-esque. Just give me the damn ball. Only in this case, he delivered. Many people thought he traveled. If they were calling traveling, did that change? Would that have changed the course or the outcome of a lot of these games? Maybe so. But we know that the Eurostep, when it was inserted and became a part of the game, the fabric of the game, you literally could traverse the entire country of
Right.
Spain or any other with the Eurostep. So officiating definitely played a role. You did hear some complaints about it. I like Tom Izzo after the game when asked, "Hey, well, what did you do to get your defense to ratchet things up in the second half and that went over New Mexico?" And he says, "Well, they were well rested because they didn't play any defense in the first half."
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So a lot of colorful stuff, as you
Yeah.
would anticipate.
But you know what? As I've been watching, the switching of pivot foots happens so often.
Oh my
The
God!
walking when they hold the ball. The
Yeah.
guy gathers the ball, bounces the ball twice to gather the ball. Then he
Yes,
waits, looks to pass. Then he dribbles again. No double dribble.
you're in the
So,
park. It's a double dribble.
yeah. So as a ball basketball guys as we are, and a
Yeah.
guy like me who did ref the game at one point or in my 20s, it's shocking to watch. But thank God for Gene Steratore and Jay Wright had a conversation last night after that play, and I figured out what they're seeing. It is now about if you bounce that ball, you could take a step before you actually have possession of the ball. So he was explaining that it looked more like the modern day Euro than it did a travel, to my eyes. And that's what he was explaining, that now they're waiting for the player to gather the ball in two hands. Then it starts as two steps. So he technically explained it. And I thought that was the best, explanation I've gotten in the last decade watching how the game has changed. So now I understand what the refs are doing, what they're calling. And I can tell you this. I took my young 10-year-old grandson and coached him for the first time this year. And again, the fundamentals are different. The kids want to shoot threes that can't even hit the rim from 21 feet, at 10 years old. And I'm like, I never shot a shot past 12 feet when I was 10 years old. And it was like, this is the way the game has gone now. And the kids were walking with the ball, and the ref told me to calm down and pulled me aside and said, if I have to call a walk, I'll be tired for blowing the whistle. So you just let it go now. And that's where the kids are learning at a young age that this is available, that extra step is available, and they're giving it to them even at the college level. And we know they're doing it at the pros. So this is what we got to get used to. Yeah, as an old school guy looking for a travel, I mean, I must have sweared at the TV.
You're screaming at the television
30
set.
times. That's a travel. Yeah, Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. All right, we have some matchups. We'll take a look at those. What we do before we get into that, we want to pay tribute. This is kind of a shocker to me. I was at a musical show, a concert, if you will, at a local venue that happens to be fantastic here in South Florida. Seeing a band out of New Orleans called Dumpster Funk, which is led by, believe it or not, the 65-year-old son of Aaron Neville. The Nevilles are to New Orleans music what the Mannings are to Louisiana football and football in general. And I didn't realize, I didn't know this guy was that old, 65-year-old son. So he's leading the band. But I was with a friend of mine who's like a sports agent and involved in a lot of stuff. So he's always on his phone, even though he's paying attention to what's going on. And about 10:30 at night, he says, turns to me, he says, George Foreman just checked out. And that was a shock. I had been talking to a couple of boxing people recently on some other shows, and one was very close with Larry Holmes. And they were telling me that guy was telling me that Holmes is sort of deteriorating. I've heard nothing. I had heard nothing about George Foreman being in any kind of poor health, and so that was a big surprise. And I guess I'm sure that people would consider the tributes that were given to George Foreman by all media outlets, including ESPN, were appropriate. But I don't know that I would have buried it behind the women's college basketball tournament, which, if you ever wanted to
Yeah,
illustrate my point, that the problem with a lot of women's sports outside of tennis, which you were witnessing
yeah,
yesterday
yeah,
firsthand at the Miami Open, the problem is the lack of depth overall. Now it's improved some in women's college basketball, where you don't just have one or two teams that dominate every year, or maybe three. It used to be
yeah.
Tennessee, Old Dominion, and UConn under
Mhm.
Gino. And outside of that, you didn't have a lot of challengers, and there was a big disparity between the top three or four teams, let's say, and the rest of the pack. But these first round games in the women's tournament, I mean, if anything, was a validation of my theory that there's a lack of depth there. How could you watch this stuff where every game is a 50-point differential?
There was some stat I saw, Jeff, that was really weird. That in the first round, they're like 301, the first top three seeds in women's basketball. Like they never get beat. So it's like, yeah, I mean, they get these lower teams and just, the girls are probably recruiting themselves again to go to places where they can win. And the great coaches recruit Dawn Staley, Gino Auriemma, you know, it's just it's really weird. But that's when I saw that stat, I was eyebrowing. I'm like thinking, you know what? You can lay 48 in these games and
Yes,
37 in these games
they
and
cover.
36 because they cover. Like
Go
it
out,
just
line up a cigar
yeah,
outside, maybe
right.
bet a couple of horse
Yeah,
races,
yeah,
come back and see, okay, we're up
yeah,
56. That's great.
right, yeah. So you saw some of that, but yeah, that's yeah, very weird. Very, very weird, but yeah, nine. I was very shocked. 9.5 minutes on Sunday Sports Center until George Foreman comes up. I think I mentioned that to you, and I said, like no expert boxing aficionado to come in on Saturday night. I did see Mark Kriegel come on, who I had a
Oh, that's your guy.
wonderful boxing conversation with back in my days in Vegas. Who sat with me for an hour and a half, and we just, without ever knowing who we are, just talked boxing, and he loved it, and it was great to talk it. But yeah, I did say this to you, and I'll be brief on this point, but I think what he had done at 45, knocking out Michael Moore after taking a beating for the first 8 rounds of that fight, I thought at that point in my existence, I thought that was the greatest accomplishment for an elderly pro athlete in the history of mankind. And I think it led to what we see in Tom Brady and the Aaron Rodgers and the LeBron James. I think Foreman laying that down, that you could win probably the most single one best crown you could have as heavyweight champion of the world. To do that at that age, at that point, who had done it earlier, I thought it was one of the greatest accomplishments in sports. I remember the night. I remember the fight. Watching the poor guy get beat. And he said, as Jim Lampley said, he's going to sit there in front of me for one split second, and I'm going to catch him. And he said, and Jim Lampley used the line, "It happened. It happened." It was like he was saying George Foreman told him that this was going to happen. And he went and looked up at God and looked up and said to the Lord, "This is what it was." And I never forget that night. I'll never forget it. It was betting wise. No one bet Michael Moore. It was the first time I ever saw something where it didn't matter what you thought. It was where your heart was in the game. It's very similar to betting now. But man, that was just one of the great sporting events that I remember watching on HBO. It was just fantastic. And was a little saddened by to hear George, and did not know he was sick either. And so
Yeah,
I go
no,
back to my childhood and watching boxing as a young kid and watching how George Foreman was a different level athlete, for me.
and ferocious, a Sonny Liston-like character when he first came on the scene. Didn't have the illicit ties to the mob that Sonny did, at least as far as I know. Seemed like he was being managed and handled by legitimate sources, although it is boxing. My buddy Brad Jacobs, now the COO of Top Rank Boxing, was the executive producer of the Tuesday Night Fights on USA Network, and he was instrumental in having George make his comeback.
Yeah.
And of course, he was on there. It seemed like every Tuesday night, knocking out some stiff, and that didn't give you much of an indication he was going to be able to handle Michael Moore, a legitimate heavyweight at the time, maybe not the greatest. I did have contact with Michael Moore later on when I was doing some boxing play-by-play and some boxing telecasts. And Michael Moore gets on a plane. We're going to Atlantic City to cover what was a WBO heavyweight title fight between Shannon the Cannon Briggs, and a guy named Sultan Ibragimov, who was the house fighter. Ibragimov ends up winning as Briggs put on a disgraceful defense of the heavyweight championship. I don't think he threw a punch. But as we get on a plane, Michael Moore, I'm in the middle seat, and Michael Moore is on the aisle. And before we took off, his head plops into my lap, literally. and he fell asleep before we took off. So they had to wake him up because you're not allowed, I guess, to be in a sleeping position on takeoff. And it was all they could do to get this guy to snap out of whatever semi coma he was in. And then as soon as we took off, his head hit my lap again, and he was that way all the way to Atlantic City. So I had his head in my lap, much like George Foreman had in his hands on that night. All right, let's take a quick perusal here. Any game stand out? You had Auburn and Michigan. Michigan had to rally to win their game. Auburn was threatened also.
Mm-hmm.
Ole Miss, Michigan State, Florida, Maryland. You're thinking Florida probably bounces back off that scare. Texas Tech and Arkansas. A lot of people like Texas Tech. Arkansas so far, a little bit of a Cinderella there after starting 0-5 in the SEC. Duke Zona. You're thinking Duke probably prevails. BYU, Alabama. We mentioned Houston, Purdue. I have Houston winning it all in that pool that we're in. So I wasn't overwhelmingly impressed with the way they handled their second round game, but maybe that was something they just needed to get out of their system. And Kentucky and Tennessee. So of those 8 games, what do you think?
I'm going to go. I like to find an upset early, that could happen and go. I think the guard Flan coming back from Arkansas is a bigger deal than people think. It gives Davis a little bit of a guy that he could go through a little bit and gives him a little rest to have a better guard out there. I think the size of Brazil and Adu, the big guys for Arkansas, match up with Williams and Toppin from Texas Tech. I think 6.5 is way too many points there. I think Calipari will have a coaching edge. And if I had to look at an upset of all those live dogs of a decent number, I would think Arkansas is my pick to get through to the Elite Eight.
All right, very good. Anything else stand out?
Yeah, the Ole Miss Michigan State game stands out. I think I mentioned to you, I was just so impressed with Ole Miss, down on them all year. And as a gambler, let me say to everybody out there, don't hold grudges against teams.
No.
You sit down and you think Ole Miss cost you when you like them, and then they lose, and then you get off them and you don't like them, and you love Iowa State and you love North Carolina and you pay the piper, and all of a sudden you're sitting there thinking about it. Well, the line's telling me Michigan State only 3 against an average Ole Miss team all year is telling me I lean a little bit Ole Miss. So, that would be kind of one of my games too. And then lastly, if I had to pick a favorite that kind of stands out to me, I don't know about Auburn and Michigan just because the size of Michigan inside. I'm not sure about Houston and Purdue just because of the experience of guards with Brady Smith, and the game being in Indianapolis might keep that game a little closer, so I'm not sure. Tennessee, Kentucky, real brief. Kentucky's beaten Tennessee twice last times at their own court. Maybe 4.5 is a little too much. It's Alabama to me. BYU, I think they're a nice run. We'll challenge the professor a little bit here. I probably think that now the athletes in the tempo plays right into Alabama's hands. Yes, it's BYU's hands, but I'll take Alabama's players and the 4.5. And Nate Oates a little bit more experienced in his spots. That would probably be the favorite that kind of stands out to me. Maybe even a little bit of Florida. Maryland running the gauntlet against Colorado State. Maybe Florida got their wake-up call, and maybe they come out and show they're a little bit more on the interior than Colorado State had the offer. Florida will give them a little bit better run. So, yeah, those are the games that stand out to me. We'll come back Thursday and give you a little bit more insight and stuff. But right now, I would say for sure Arkansas is what really my eyes – I thought that line should be 3.5 at 6.5. I love it.
A generous allotment of points. All right, the Big Gunner, you're going to be in action tomorrow.
Yep. Tomorrow we talk about Jamius. A lot of people are upset. Yeah, a little upset. I'm not. I think for the money they paid him, it's actually cheaper than Drew Locks, and I like the kid. I liked him last year when he was praising God that he had this opportunity on a Thursday night game to play this deal. Like, love all that stuff. Maybe they brought him in for a locker room guy, and maybe they're looking at Shedeur Sanders now. That makes me think that the Giants are going to go a little different than what I thought. That I think if Shedeur Sanders is sitting there at 3 with Jamius and Shedeur in a quarterback room, I think that might be what maybe the extra coach that Shedeur needs. So I wouldn't be surprised now to see the Giants make a move differently. That I wanted to get Travis Hunter or someone else. Now I think Shedeur Sanders might be in the mix for the Giants.
All right, what time are we getting underway with the Big Gunner tomorrow?
10 a.m. tomorrow.
All right, beautiful. So pretty much following this, if you're on East Coast time. Mike, always a pleasure, my friend. Thanks so much. And we'll talk again on Thursday, and I'll be watching the Big Gunner podcast tomorrow right here on NoFilter.net. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Mike Jones, ladies and gentlemen. That's going to do it for our edition today, our Monday Peel Yourself Off the Mat edition of Bury Your Bookie, hoping that you managed to do just that and that your brackets are somewhat intact as we head into the second week of the NCAA tournament. For Mike Jones, I'm Jeff DeForrest. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. We'll see you tomorrow with Scotty M on the next edition of Bury Your Bookie.